By dawn in 1912, just outside Pueblo, Colorado, they found the lamp standing upright in the gravel beside the low switch house, and the glass was uncracked. The metal was still warm. Not cool from the night air. Warm. A man's hand could feel the heat coming off the brass collar where the oil sat burning. The wick had burned down to almost nothing, but it had burned. That much was certain. And the man who carried it was gone. His name was Samuel Kearney, 43 years old, steady man, the kind the railroad kept on because he didn't drink before a shift and he didn't talk back to the foreman. He had a wife named Catherine and 2 daughters, one married already to a clerk in town, the other still in school. Samuel had worked the Pueblo yard for 14 years. He knew every tie, every switch stand, every place the grade got soft when the spring thaw came. Men in Pueblo, Colorado, still won't work that stretch of yard before sunrise, and they still don't talk loud about why. The night before, around 4 in the morning, Samuel had been in the tower with 2 other men. The night dispatcher, a boy named Hector who was learning the signals, and an older hand called Dalton, who had been working that tower since before the Spanish-American War. They were watching the rails for the northbound freight that was supposed to come through before dawn. It was cold that night, the kind of cold where your breath comes out in clouds and your hands stay in your pockets until the very second you have to move them. There was frost on the tie plates, and frost on the window glass of the tower, and the world below looked like it had been stopped mid-motion, held still under a layer of ice. Around 4:15, the dispatcher received a wire. An incoming line needed a siding cleared. Samuel was to go down into the yard, find the low switch stand about 200 yards south and throw it to clear track 7. Simple work. Work he had done 1,000 times. He put on his heavy coat. He took his oil lamp from the hook where it hung. Catherine would be asleep. She would wake up around 6 o'clock to start the stove for breakfast. Samuel would be back in his chair reading the paper by then, or maybe already heading back to the yard for the day shift. This was routine. This was what happened every night and every morning in that place. Hector watched him go, saw Samuel step out of the tower and start walking south along the gravel bed beside the tracks. The lamp swung in his hand. It made a slow, moving circle of orange light against the dark. Every few steps, Samuel's breath crossed through that light. You could see it. You could see a man walking into the frozen dark with a lamp the size of his fist, and that lamp was the only thing alive in the whole yard besides him. The tower had a clear view south, straight sight line. Dalton had already turned back to the dispatch table, but Hector kept watching. He was new. He liked to watch. He liked to see how the yard worked when everything was asleep except the rails and the men who kept them moving. He watched Samuel reach the switch stand. The lamp went down. Samuel was bending over the lever. Standard work. Nothing that should take more than a minute. The switch handle was heavy sometimes in winter cold. The grease got stiff. But Samuel was strong. He had thrown that switch in worse weather than this. That was when Hector saw the signal arm move. The signal arm that stood above the switch house. It moved. Not slowly. Hard. Like someone had pulled on the lever with force. The arm went from stop to proceed in one motion. Hector called down through the speaking tube. Samuel, Samuel, you there? There was no answer, just the wind against the tower and the sound of the freezing night. Hector called again. Samuel, confirm the switch. Still nothing. They waited maybe 2 minutes. Then Dalton told Hector to go down and check. Hector took a lantern and went down the tower stairs. They were metal, and they were so cold they burned your hand even through gloves. And he walked out into the yard. The frost was so thick it crunched under his boots. His breath made a wall of fog in front of his face. He walked toward the switch house, and the closer he got, the more the cold seemed to stop him. Not because it got colder, but because something wasn't right. Some part of him, the part that lives in a man's chest, not in his head, was telling him not to go further. He went anyway. He had to. That was the job. When Hector reached the switch stand, he saw the lamp first. It was standing upright in the gravel about 3 feet from the lever housing. The glass was uncracked. The metal frame was still warm. The oil inside was still burning. And there was no Samuel. Hector called his name. Then he called it louder. "Samuel! Samuel, where are you?" The yard was empty. The night was empty. There was nothing but frost and gravel and the sound of his own voice hitting the dark and coming back to him sounding strange and hollow. Hector looked at the ground. In the frost he could see boot prints. They came from the north, from the tower. They went to the switch stand. And they stopped there. They stopped right beside the lamp. There were no prints going away. There were no prints going anywhere else. The ground around the lamp and the switch was clean, untouched, like Samuel had simply ceased. Hector ran back to the tower. He told Dalton and the dispatcher. The dispatcher sent a wire to the foreman's house. By 5 o'clock in the morning, men were gathering in the yard. By sunrise, there were 40 of them, walking with lanterns, looking at the ground, calling Samuel's name. By the time Catherine woke up and realized her husband had not come home, the entire railroad yard at Pueblo was in motion, and the warm lamp, still warm, still burning, was being handled carefully by men whose hands were shaking from more than just the cold. The men who found the lamp were railroad men, and railroad men do not panic easily. They have seen derailments and coupling failures and men crushed between cars. They have learned to move methodically even when the world is breaking in front of them. But what they were seeing didn't fit any accident they knew. Hector kept telling the story the same way, and every time he told it, it sounded more impossible. Boot prints going in, no boot prints going out. The lamp still warm. Samuel just gone. The foreman's name was Matthias Cole. He had been working railways for 30 years. He listened to Hector's account. Then he looked at the lamp himself, felt the heat, and said nothing for a long time. Then he told the men to start a search. Not a panic. A search. Organized. Grid pattern. They would mark the areas they had already checked by tying strips of cloth to the fence posts and switch standards. They would work methodically from the switch house outward in expanding squares. They would check every building in the yard, every storage shed, every tank. They would look in the river. They would drag hooks through the shallow water. They would call his name, and they would not stop until they found him. But first, they needed to establish what time he had actually disappeared. 3 different men had heard the signal arm move. Hector had heard it from the tower and called down through the tube. Dalton had heard it too. The dispatcher had marked the time in his log, 4:31 a.m. After that, silence. No answer when they called. No sound at all. Samuel's walk from the tower to the switch stand should have taken him maybe 5 minutes. The switch itself should take another minute, maybe 2. By 4:40, he should have been walking back to the tower. He was not. By 4:50, they should have been worried enough to send someone down. They had. What confused the men, though, was what happened at 4:47. The dispatcher had heard it first. A whistle. 2 notes. Sharp and clear. The kind of whistle you make with your mouth when you're calling livestock. Cattle whistle. Hector heard it too, standing in the tower window. It came from the south, from past the switch house, from somewhere out in the dark where the yard ended and the open pasture began. Dalton said, "That's Samuel. He's calling for help." But when they looked out into the dark with their lanterns, there was nothing. No one, just the frost and the grass beyond the yard fence. Then at 5:04 a.m., after Samuel had already been gone for more than half an hour, one of the hands checking the north gate reported something. The herd, the cattle that grazed in the pasture north of the rail yard behind the stock gate, they were walking, all of them, moving in a line toward the yard gate, and nobody was driving them. Nobody was on horseback. Nobody was even there, yet the cattle were walking home on their own, moving through the frozen dark with a kind of purpose, like someone had called them and they had answered. Matthias Cole stood at the switch house and listened to this. He felt the lamp again. It was cooling now, but still warm. Still impossible. He made a decision. He sent men to the far end of the yard, beyond the switch house, out toward the scrub, and the dried mesquite that grew where the railroad property ended and the open land began. He kept a core group close to the lamp and the switch stand, and he sent runners back to town to alert the police and to notify the families who worked the yard. By 6:30 a.m., The whole town was beginning to wake up to the fact that Samuel Kearney was missing, and no one could explain how. The search began in earnest once the sun started to come up. Men with lanterns, though lanterns hardly mattered anymore with the light. Men with ropes. Men with shovels. Men with long hooks for dragging. Hector brought one of the railroad's dogs, a big setter named Marcus who was used to helping track lost stock. Marcus was a good dog, calm, reliable. But when they brought him to the switch stand and showed him the lamp, he would not go near it. The men tried 3 times to get him to track from that spot to pick up a scent and follow. Each time Marcus circled the lamp once, then lay down on the gravel and would not move. His ears went back. He whined low in his throat. After a few minutes, he rolled onto his side and refused to even look in the direction where the boot prints disappeared. By mid-morning, they had tied cloth strips to 23 fence posts and switch standards. They had marked off the grid. Men walked shoulder to shoulder through the scrub south of the yard, pushing through the mesquite, calling Samuel's name. Nothing. They checked the water tower. Nothing. They checked inside every storage shed, every locked building. They looked in the locomotive house. They even looked in the coal car that had been sitting empty on a side track. Nothing. No blood. No torn clothing. No sign of struggle. No body. Nothing but the impossible fact that a man had walked into that yard with a lamp, thrown a switch, and ceased to exist. Around noon, one of the older hands, a man named Wickham, who had worked that yard for nearly as long as Samuel had, pulled Matthias aside. "People in Pueblo, Colorado are going to talk about this," Wickham said. "The old men are already talking, and they're telling the young ones, you don't work that stretch of yard alone at night anymore. Not after this. Not ever again." It was a strange thing to say when the body hadn't even been found yet, but Wickham was right. By that afternoon, something had shifted in the town's mind. The search continued, but it was no longer entirely rational. It was becoming something else. It was becoming a ritual. Women brought baskets of bread and coffee to the men at the yard. Children stood at the fence and watched without understanding. The priest came. The police came. By evening, there were nearly 100 people gathered around the rail yard waiting for news that never came. That night, as the sun went down and the temperature dropped again toward freezing, the searchers brought out new lanterns and prepared to work through the dark. Matthias Cole made a decision. They would search the pasture. Not just the yard, the open land beyond where the stock grazed. It was rough terrain. It was cold. But it had to be done. Around 6 p.m., a party of 12 men, including Matthias, Hector, and Wickham, took lanterns and ropes and moved out past the stock gate, past the thorn fence that marked the edge of the yard property, and into the open pasture where the cattle had been when Samuel disappeared. They walked in a line. They moved slowly. They called his name. The grass was frozen hard enough to crunch under their boots. The wind was picking up. It moved across the open ground with nothing to stop it, and it carried the smell of dust and something else. Something like metal, like iron heated and then cooled in cold water. Hector noticed it. So did Wickham. Neither man said anything, but both of them knew. That smell should not be there. There was no forge out here. No fire. No reason for hot metal to be cooling in the dark. They spread out wider. They moved further. The lanterns made circles of weak light that barely held against the dark. And then, from somewhere far off, far enough away that no one could be certain which direction it came from, they heard it again. The 2-note whistle, the cattle call, coming from nowhere, coming from everywhere, the sound of a man calling livestock in the dark. But there was no man, and everyone knew it. The search party stopped moving. The men stood where they were, holding their lanterns up, listening to the dark. The whistle did not come again, but the cold seemed to deepen, and when they looked down at the frozen ground where they were standing, they could see boot prints leading in every direction, overlapping, crossing, circling back on themselves like something or someone had been walking here in patterns that made no sense. But none of the men standing there had made those prints. The ground was frozen solid. Nothing was marked until that moment. By the 3rd day, the search had transformed into something that looked less like detective work and more like penance. The men no longer moved as a search party. They moved as a ritual. Grids laid out, measured, marked with rope and cloth. Every section walked twice, then 3 times. Every section marked with chalk where nothing was found. The riverbed was dredged, the water tank was drained and searched inside. The root cellar beneath the dispatcher's house was excavated. The mine shaft 7 miles north was explored with lanterns and ropes, though no one truly believed Samuel had walked that far. But they had to check. They had to be thorough. Because the alternative was accepting that something had happened that could not be explained by any normal process of the world. Women came to the yard and set up a station near the main gate. They brought coffee in large metal pots. They brought bread and cheese. They brought blankets. Mothers brought their children and then pulled them back, telling them not to look too far past the fence line. The priest came twice a day. The police chief came from Denver and spent 2 days examining everything, taking notes and finding nothing that helped. By the 4th day, he told Matthias Cole that officially, the investigation had reached its limits. A man does not vanish. A man runs, or a man falls into water, or a man is taken. But a man does not vanish. Yet here was a man who had. On the 5th day, they found the note. It was discovered by a young hand named Thomas who was checking the north fence line for the 3rd time. The note was wedged into the wood of a fence post, folded once, and placed carefully so that it would not blow away. Thomas brought it to Matthias without opening it. Matthias unfolded it slowly. His hands were shaking. The handwriting was Samuel's. Everyone in the yard knew Samuel's handwriting. He had filled out work logs for 14 years. His signature was on 100 documents. This was his hand. This was his pen. And the date written at the top of the note was November 14th, 3 days after he had disappeared. The note said, "Check the fence line west of the stock gate. Look where the ground stays soft even in winter." Matthias read it twice. Then he read it aloud to Hector and Wickham. No one spoke. Then Hector said, "That's impossible. Samuel's been gone for 5 days. He didn't write this 3 days ago." Matthias said nothing. He simply folded the note carefully and placed it in his pocket. Then he organized a team of men. They went to the fence line west of the stock gate. They took shovels. They looked for ground that stayed soft. They found nothing at first. But they kept digging, and about 4 feet down in soil that was still dark and damp when all the rest of the ground was frozen, they found something, a piece of cloth. Samuel's shirt, torn, dirty, soaked, but nothing else. No bones, no body, just the cloth, folded up in the wet earth like someone had buried it carefully and deliberately, knowing it would be found. That night, the yard was silent. The search continued, but the men moved without speaking. The impossible had become real, not real in the sense that it made sense, but real in the sense that no one could deny it anymore. Samuel had written a note 3 days after he vanished. Samuel's clothing was buried in the ground where the note had told them to look. Samuel was gone, and he was also still here, somehow, somewhere, in a way that made no sense to the mind but was undeniable to the eyes. Theories began to circulate, spoken quietly, in the darkness between lantern light, men standing together, warming their hands on coffee cups, their voices low. Some said he had enemies in the yard, Wickham told younger hands, maybe someone who wanted him gone. Others said the land out past the thorn fence never gives back what it takes, that it's old land, that it remembers something from before the railroad came through. A few whispered it wasn't a man at all that threw that switch, that what came back with the cattle wasn't Samuel at all, but something wearing his face, something that could write his handwriting but couldn't quite get the rest right. But no one said these things out loud where they could be heard by the police or the authorities. They said them in the yard at night. They said them to the younger men when they were learning how to work the switches. They said them as warnings, because by the end of the first week, a pattern had begun to form in the minds of everyone in Pueblo, Colorado. And the pattern was this: do not go out there alone. Do not cross that pasture at night. Do not answer if you hear a whistle coming from past the fence. And under no circumstances should you work the low switch stand without having another man with you, close enough that you can see his lantern and hear his breathing. Old hands in Pueblo, Colorado still tell the new ones this on their first week, and they tell it not as folklore. They tell it as instruction, as survival, as the price of working in that yard and living to go home. On the 10th day, Matthias Cole made a decision. The search was over. They had found nothing that made sense. They had found only the impossible. The shirt would be buried properly. Samuel's name would be entered into the railroad's records as missing circumstances unknown. His wife would receive a pension. His daughters would grow up knowing that their father had walked into the frozen dark and had never come back, and that something in that dark had sent back his shirt and his handwriting, but not his body, and that this thing was something that no one in Pueblo, Colorado could name or explain or speak about, except in whispers on cold nights, when the wind was right and no one else could hear. The lamp was placed in a box. Matthias kept it in his office. No one wanted to touch it, because even after 10 days, even after all the searching and the digging and the impossible note, the lamp was still warm. Not hot, but warm. On some mornings, the metal was so warm that you could feel the heat radiating from inside the box without opening it, and sometimes men swore they could smell ash and metal in the air near that box, even though there was no fire, and there had never been any ash. The oil had burned down to nothing. The wick was gone. There was no reason for heat to be there, and no reason for that particular smell of burning iron to persist. But it did. It persisted. And the men of Pueblo, Colorado, learned to work around it. Learned to accept it. Learned to pass down the story of Samuel Kearney to every new hand who came to work the yard, and to tell them that some things in this world do not follow the rules that make sense, and that the only safety is to remember that, and to obey the rules that the land makes whether you understand them or not. 53 years later, in 1965, they replaced the gate. The old stock gate, the one where the cattle had walked back through on their own, the one that stood at the edge of the pasture where Samuel Kearney had never returned from, that gate was removed and a new one was installed. It was stronger. It was made of better metal. But no one who worked the yard used it if they could avoid it. They would walk around it. They would go through the main entrance of the yard, even if it meant an extra quarter mile. The new gate opened onto the same pasture, the same frozen ground, the same fence line that ran west where the earth stayed soft even in winter. It did not matter that it was a different gate. The place was the same, and the place had a memory. By 1965, there were railroad men working that yard who had never known Samuel Kearney. His daughters were grown women with children of their own. Catherine had died in 1931, and the house where she had waited for Samuel that last morning was owned by someone else now. Someone who did not know the story except as rumor. But the story persisted anyway. It persisted the way stories persist in small communities, passed from mouth to mouth, from the old hands to the young ones, refined and hardened by repetition until it became less like memory and more like law. The young men who came to work the yard were told on their first day not to work the low switch stand alone. They were told this casually, as though it were simply the way things were done. No one explained why. No one had to. By the time a man had been there a month, he knew. Either someone had told him the full story, or he had felt the strangeness that hung around that part of the yard. The way the air seemed different there, the way dogs would not go near the switch house at night, the way some men refused to cross the pasture before dawn, even when they had legitimate work that required it. In 1952, 40 years after Samuel disappeared, the old tower was torn down, and a new, more modern one was built further north. The new tower had electric lights and a telephone instead of a speaking tube. It had heat in the winter. It was efficient. But for the first 10 years it stood, no one wanted to work the night shift in it. They would request day shifts. They would request transfers. They would find reasons to quit rather than spend 8 hours in that tower watching the same yard, looking down at the same switch stand, waiting for something that might happen again. Eventually, younger men came who did not know the story well enough to be afraid, and the night shifts were filled. But even those men, the ones who had not been told directly, the ones who thought it was all just superstition, even they learned quickly. They learned by feeling it, by the quality of the silence on certain nights. by the way the frost formed on the window glass of the tower in shapes that seemed almost deliberate, by the sound that came sometimes from the south, from the direction of the pasture, when there was no wind to explain it. The lamp remained in Matthias Cole's office until Matthias retired in 1924. He left it in a wooden box with a note attached. "Keep this, don't ask why. Just keep it." After that, it moved from office to office as foremen changed. It was kept in a locked cabinet. Some foremen would not allow anyone to open it. Some would ask if the stories about it were true, and the men who had actually worked with it would say nothing, or would simply open the box and let the foreman feel the warmth for himself. By 1965, the lamp had been locked in that box for so long that most men forgot what it looked like. But they did not forget that it was there. And they did not forget the smell that sometimes came from the office on cold nights. The smell of ash, of hot metal, of something burning that could not be burning. In the 1950s, after the tower was rebuilt, the railroad considered paving the yard and modernizing the whole operation. The plans included filling in part of the pasture and moving the low switch stand to a different location, one that was closer to the main office in full view of the new tower. But when word got out, and word did get out somehow, spreading through the railroad men like a rumor that could not be contained, the resistance was absolute. Men said they would refuse the assignment if the work proceeded. They said they would quit. They said they would strike if necessary. This was unusual for railroad men. They were not known for making demands or taking stands on matters of sentiment. But this was not sentiment. This was something else. This was a community protecting itself from a knowledge that it had been given. So the plans were canceled. The low switch stand remained where it was. The pasture remained untouched. The gate remained. And the story remained. By the 1960s, people in Pueblo, Colorado, who had nothing to do with the railroad knew the story anyway. Mothers told it to children to keep them away from certain places. Teachers heard it from students. The priest heard confessions from men who had seen things they could not explain near that rail yard at night. The story had become local history. It had become legend. It had become the kind of story that shapes how a community understands itself, as a place where something inexplicable had happened, and where the only response was to accept it and build a culture of avoidance around it. No one in Pueblo, Colorado, conducted the cattle at night on that stretch of pasture anymore. No one crossed it alone before dawn. No one answered if they heard a whistle from that direction. Children were told, as a matter of fact, the way other children were told not to play with fire. You do not go to that gate. You do not cross that pasture at night. You do not answer the whistle. And when they asked why, they were told because. Just because. And they grew up accepting this as truth, the way children accept the rules of the world they are born into. The railroad eventually declined. By 1980, the yard was running at half capacity. By 1990, it was mostly automated, and the men who had once worked the switches by hand were gone. But even after the yard went quiet, even after the trains stopped coming through as they once had, the story did not fade. It was told at family dinners. It appeared in local histories. A man from Denver came in the 1970s and wrote an article about it for a regional magazine, and the article treated it with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for genuine mysteries. The article did not solve anything. It could not. But it confirmed something. That this thing had happened, and that it was real. Not in the sense that it conformed to the laws of the natural world, but real in the sense that a community had organized itself around it, had passed it down, had made it foundational to their understanding of that place. The lamp was eventually donated to a museum in Pueblo in 1998, on the condition that it be kept in a climate-controlled case and that the temperature of its metal be recorded daily. For the first 6 months, the readings were normal. The lamp was cold when the room was cold, warm when the room was warm. But then in the winter of that year, readings began to show something anomalous. The metal of the lamp would register as several degrees warmer than the surrounding air, even when the room was held at a constant temperature by the museum's systems. The museum director attributed this to a faulty sensor, but when they replaced the sensor, the readings remained the same. The lamp was warm. It should not have been warm, but it was. So the museum simply recorded this in their notes and moved on. They did not make a public announcement. They did not draw attention to it, but anyone who read the museum's catalog carefully could see that the temperature readings made no sense, and that they had never made sense, and that the lamp had been impossible for more than 80 years. Which version of this story makes sense here? And which version does nobody in Pueblo, Colorado dare to say out loud? Was Samuel Kearney murdered? And did someone use his handwriting and his knowledge of the yard to confuse the search? Or did he fall into the river and did the note and the clothing simply wash up later as the river has a way of returning what it takes? Or did something happen to him in that moment between the tower and the switch stand that made him cease to exist in any normal sense? That made him step into the pasture and into a version of the world where different rules applied, where time moved differently, where a man could write a note 3 days after he vanished, and where a lamp could stay warm for more than a century without any source of heat? The people of Pueblo, Colorado have never agreed on an answer. They have simply agreed to remember, to pass the story down, to keep their children away from that gate, to avoid that stretch of pasture before dawn, to not answer the whistle if they hear it in the dark. Because whether Samuel Kearney was murdered, or whether he fell, or whether he stepped into something else entirely, whatever happened out there, it left a mark on that place, and the mark has never healed. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.